Lady Sky here. Let's talk about monsters. Some monsters kill for money, some for love, others for revenge. Then there are some that kill for even pettier reasons, like games for instance. Be it video games or even board games, sometimes competition is too much to handle. Other times, the competition isn't even the issue. Those are the monsters we're here to talk about today. Here, in no particular order, are 5 people who murdered someone over a game. A small note here, I do not believe that video games cause violence. It's an absurd belief, and I hope you'll see that demonstrated throughout this video. Number 5. Daniel Petrick. Daniel had a good life growing up, the youngest of 3 at 16 years old and the son of a preacher. His parents, Mark and Susan Petrick, were caring, though a tad strict. In 2007, Daniel had contracted staphylococcus from an injury received in a jet ski accident. He was kept home from school and discovered Halo 3 during this time while staying at a friend's house. While Daniel did have a game system, his parents would only allow him to play games they approved of. Anything they deemed violent or sexual or games that had an adult rating were off limits. However, Daniel, being your average, well, mostly average, rebellious teenager, stuck out and managed to purchase the game anyway, as he'd done before with other games in the past, hiding away in his room during his recovery and playing games for close to 18 hours straight at times. His father had previously stated that if he found any violent games in the house, he would destroy them. Daniel's mother caught him with it before he'd even played it and told her husband, who promptly confiscated the game and locked it away in a lockbox, the very same lockbox where he stored his 9mm Taurus PT-92 handgun, in fact. A mistake that would come back to haunt him merely a week later. Daniel somehow obtained the key to his father's lockbox and took not only the game, but the gun as well. He approached his parents afterward while they were sitting on the couch. He calmly asked, quote, "Would you close your eyes? I have a present for you." His father later stated that he, quote, "expected a pleasant surprise." What he got instead was something no father would expect from the child they raised. After he'd closed his eyes, his head went numb, and blood began trickling down his arm from the bullet he was now aware was in his head. He looked over to where his wife was sitting, her now lifeless body slumped over on the love seat, having been shot in the arms, chest, and head. This had barely registered before Daniel was shoving the gun into his father's hand, saying, quote, "Hey, Dad, here's your gun. Take it." His father quite possibly would have died that day, with him and his wife's murder being framed by their son to look like a suicide if it weren't for his daughter. Daniel's sister Heidi and her husband Andrew happened to be coming over that day to watch an Indians game with the family. Daniel's father recalled hearing a knock at the door and the voice of his daughter, followed by Daniel saying, quote, "You guys shouldn't come in. Mom and Dad had a big argument." Heidi and her husband later testified at the trial that they had heard what they described as a moan or possibly their names being groaned from inside the house. They forced their way in and discovered her mother dead and her father bleeding on the ground. Though his jaw was shattered, Daniel's father indicated to his daughter that her brother had done this, all while Daniel denied it and tried desperately to pin it on his dad. Heidi proceeded to call 911, while Daniel had managed to grab the gun from the couch. Andrew took it from Daniel, who relinquished it without a fight. Daniel then attempted to escape in the family's van, but was caught a short time later with Halo 3 on the passenger seat next to him. As he was arrested, he shouted, quote, "My dad shot my mom!" During the trial, the defense tried to argue that Daniel didn't understand the finality of his actions due to playing such violent video games, that in fact he was addicted to these games, even making such a ridiculous claim as, quote, "I feel confident that if there were no such thing as violent video games, I wouldn't know Daniel Petrick." The prosecution retaliated with, quote, "You can't become addicted to something you haven't played," pointing out that the game had been confiscated from Daniel before he even had the chance to play it. Also saying that, in aiming the gun at his own mother, quote, "His hand was steady. This is not a shaking addict having trouble with his thought process." In the end, Daniel was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 23 years for aggravated murder, 10 years for attempted aggravated murder, and 5 years for tampering with evidence, along with a 3-year firearm specification to be served consecutively with the life sentence. All sentences are to be served concurrently. This was the minimum sentence. He could not be sentenced to death due to his age, and the maximum sentence was life without the possibility of parole. His father and sister have since stated they forgive him and just want him to come home so they can all heal. Number 4. Cameron Coker. also known, eerily enough, as Little Rambo. Cameron proves this isn't a new phenomenon, and that even young children can be monsters. Cameron lived a relatively normal life for a young country boy. His mother, Patricia Coker, was a seamstress. His father, Keith Coker, an avid hunter. As is common in such households, the father and son would frequently go on hunting trips together. The father taught his son how to shoot, how to load a gun, and how to care for his weapon. At 9 years old, he knew how to handle these guns as well as, if not better than, any adult. Unfortunately, it seems his father didn't teach him the most important part: to respect these weapons, not to use them to hurt others, and to not treat them like a toy. He also failed to keep these weapons out of reach of Cameron when they weren't hunting. On March 6, 1989, Cameron headed to a neighbor's house to play with other neighborhood children. Among them, 7-year-old Jessica Carr, who challenged him to a game of Spy Hunter, boasting that she was better at the game. Indeed, she was, for Cameron's age and knowledge didn't work to his advantage as he'd expected, and she promptly beat him. He was a bit upset, which was to be expected. However, what came next was the last thing anyone would have anticipated. The neighbor pushed all of the kids outside to have some fun and play in the snow. The kids were punished from the game system because they hadn't cleaned up their mess. Cameron was upset that he was punished, insisting he didn't make any mess, so he instead opted to stomp home, still visibly upset. He arrived to an empty house, perfect for what he had in mind. He stomped upstairs to his parents' room, retrieved a key that Keith had apparently kept hidden in the base of a lamp belonging to his gun cabinet, and retrieved a .35 caliber Marlin rifle from among the 10 weapons in the case. He then retrieved the proper ammo from a locked drawer and loaded his gun. He proceeded to open window, remove the screen from the window, and got into position. He aimed at the snowmobile Jessica was riding across the yard with another neighborhood child, lined her up in the scope, and took a shot. 100 yards away, Jessica dropped to the snow. Cameron's aim had been incredibly accurate. He replaced the screen, closed the window, returned the gun to the cabinet, and placed the empty shell casing in the ammo box. Moments later, the neighbor, whose house Cameron had just left, called and ordered Cameron to return. He was concerned for Cameron. It seemed there was a sniper in the neighborhood, and he was worried about Cameron getting hurt. As Cameron entered the neighbor's home once more, there were children screaming and crying, praying for Jessica, who was bleeding to death on the living room floor. Cameron simply stated, quote, "If you don't think about it, you won't be sad," showing no emotion to the tragedy that was unfolding in front of him. In fact, he sat down and began playing a video game. A state police trooper on the scene happened to notice a cut shaped like a half moon on Cameron's forehead. Later, after investigators found Cameron's blood on both the rifle and near the bedroom window, it was revealed to be a cut from the rifle scope received during recoil. At 9 years old, Cameron Coker was being arrested for murder. There was much debate as to whether Cameron should be charged as a boy or as a man, given the seriousness of the crime and Cameron's behavior. Psychiatrists had deemed him to be mentally fit, though emotionally removed from the situation, even falling asleep during one appearance in court. The case dragged on for 3.5 years, until Jessica's mother, Donna, signed off on a plea deal, though she was reluctant to do so and almost immediately regretted it, as Cameron was convicted of merely a misdemeanor involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to probation until the age of 21, no jail time, and no marks on his permanent record. Jessica's mother said of the sentence, quote, "Involuntary manslaughter means it's an accident. It wasn't an accident." In any case, Cameron, who is now 37 years old, hasn't been in any major trouble since. Number 3. Alejandro Morales. On January 3, 2009, 9-year-old Anthony Maldonado was at his uncle's home for the holidays, playing his brand new PlayStation he'd received that Christmas with a friend of the family, Alejandro Morales. Alejandro was 25 at the time and had already accumulated quite the rap sheet. He had prior arrests and convictions for larceny, disorderly conduct, and marijuana possession. He even had open cases against him at the time, including charges of menacing, harassment, and weapons possession. Nonetheless, he was allowed to be left alone in the room with Alejandro, while other possible family members left to get something to eat, and his aunt and uncle retired to their bedroom. I say possible family members here, as the reports are very conflicting. Some articles state Anthony was there with 2 brothers of his and cousins. Another states just 1 brother and some cousins. Others still say that Anthony had no brothers, and in fact wasn't related to anyone in the house at the time besides his aunt and uncle. Regardless of the family tree, At around 3:30 a.m., an argument broke out between Anthony and Alejandro over the game. Shortly after, Anthony knocked on his uncle's door saying, quote, "I've been stabbed." Anthony's uncle opened the door to see Anthony collapsed on the ground. He had knife wounds on his face and appeared to have been stabbed several times. He also had bruises, indicating there had been a struggle between the two before he was stabbed. The ambulance was called immediately, and Anthony was rushed to the hospital. Shortly after 4:19 a.m., Anthony was pronounced dead. Now this may possibly be one of those times where the monster is in someone's head. As it turns out, Alejandro was incredibly disturbed. In fact, he'd been diagnosed several times with paranoid schizophrenia before this incident. He was actually on parole for an assault conviction and was taking antipsychotic meds at the time. Which begs the question why this man was left alone with anyone, let alone a 9-year-old child. Especially since after the incident, he fled the apartment barefoot, hiding the knife in a trash compactor and attempting to lie to the police, telling them he'd been robbed. It's clear, in my opinion, that he was aware of what he'd done was wrong. He attempted to cover it up. This typically doesn't apply to someone so severely mentally ill as Alejandro is being portrayed. Alejandro was eventually found not guilty by reason of insanity. Shortly after the verdict was read, Alejandro punched his lawyer in the face. He also attempted to fight the cops that subdued him. According to his lawyer, this was just more evidence of his mental instability. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Number 2. Anissa Weier and Morgan Geyser. Most monsters are older, teenagers or adults. Sometimes monsters are young and impressionable. These monsters are fascinated by other monsters, either real or fictional. Most times that fascination leads to obsession, inspiration, and inevitably, tragedy. In this case, it's a near tragedy that has been dubbed the Slender-Man stabbing. Not sure if it was just the game that caused this, or indeed the entire mythos surrounding Slender-Man, but I felt it was worth including here. On May 30th, 2014, 3 12-year-old girls had a sleepover to celebrate the birthday of another girl. The very next day, one of them would be clinging to life. Prior to the sleepover, the 2 young girls had discovered Slender-Man on Creepypasta Wiki. Their interest quickly turned into a sort of sick obsession. The girls fully believed Slender-Man was real. However, instead of telling someone their concerns, they devised a twisted plot to appease Slender-Man. Apparently they wanted to protect their families, and according to them, that meant proving their loyalty and becoming a follower of Slender-Man. This would allow them to prove his existence, which would somehow allow them to protect their families. They believed killing someone was the best way to do this, and that afterward, they would become servants to Slender-Man and live in a mansion with him in Nicollet National Forest. They'd originally planned to do it at the birthday party while she was sleeping. They wanted to duct tape her mouth, stab her in the throat with a knife, and make their escape. Supposedly, one of the girls decided to spare her life for another day, and they waited another night. The next day, they planned to do it in a bathroom at the park, but changed this to better suit their delusions, and instead settled on murdering her in the forest during a game of hide-and-seek. While playing, Anissa held their victim, Peyton Leutner, down on the ground and ordered Morgan to stab Peyton with a knife Morgan had brought along from home. Anissa claimed she couldn't, so Morgan had to. Morgan agreed, and when asked in court later on where she'd stabbed the victim, she managed to choke out, "everywhere," in reply. In fact, Peyton had been stabbed a total of 19 times in her torso, arms, and legs. 2 of the stab wounds were to major arteries, one of which missed her heart by less than a millimeter. The other actually entered her diaphragm, slicing her liver and stomach as well. As she lay bleeding, the 2 girls told Peyton they were leaving to get her help, but instead attempted to flee. Peyton was strong, however, and somehow managed to drag herself out of the forest and into a ditch alongside a road. There she managed to flag down a cyclist by saying, quote, "Please help me, I've been stabbed." Luckily, the cyclist heard her and stopped to call 911. As soon as the police arrived, Peyton was able to tell the officers the name of one of the girls. She was immediately taken to a hospital to undergo surgery. She had been severely injured in the cardiac box area, which includes your lungs and aorta. There is a 25 to 50% mortality rate on average with injuries like the ones Peyton received. It's amazing that she had managed to survive. A massive search ensued, including police departments in Waukesha, as well as Waukesha County, New Berlin, and Brookfield, along with Waukesha Fire Department and Fight for Life emergency helicopter services. They were eventually caught walking on Interstate 94. As they were hauled away, they seemed indifferent about it all, truly believing they had done what was needed to be done. They were sad about their friend, but felt it was for a good cause. Peyton was hospitalized for 6 days and was released, though still had some issues afterward. After many, many delays, one girl being put in and out of a mental institution and being diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, as well as schizophrenia like her father, and the other girl being diagnosed with schizotypy and a delusional disorder, the sentences were finally handed down. Just this past September, Morgan was found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. It's still being determined how long she will be in the mental hospital. Then in December, Anissa was sentenced to up to 25 years in a state mental institution. She will have to serve at least 3 more sentences in a state hospital. She will then remain under supervision for the rest of the sentence. This includes time served. She will be 37, with most of her life wasted over a creepy story. I don't fully believe they were incapable of understanding their actions. It was all premeditated. They tried to run, they clearly knew right from wrong, and they knew what they were doing was wrong. This is just my opinion, however, so you all can share yours as well. Number 1. Tyler Barris. Our final monster is one you may have heard of, quite recently in fact. There are monsters that plan things, obsess over things, or just snap one day. Then there are the monsters that never thought they'd be a monster. These are the ones that don't think things through, that don't consider the consequences of their actions, quick to react, and more often than not, overreact. Tyler Barris is a 25-year-old kid. I say kid, even if he is only 3 years younger, because when I observed his Twitter at the time of this incident, that is how he came across to me. Young and dumb, very boastful of his actions, not a care in the world. That was all before Tyler fully grasped the severity of his actions, before he was aware of his role in a tragedy. It all began over $1.50. You heard me correctly. There's no misplaced decimal here. That was the wager over an online Call of Duty tournament on UMG Gaming. I cannot confirm if this started because one of the men involved refused to pay up or what. I don't know, that part has been kind of hard to find, so it's only mentioned that the wager started the argument. This led to one of the men involved to contact Tyler, who was quite known at the time for swatting, not just people, but events as well. And the other man apparently found out that Tyler had been contacted and decided to escalate things even further. He DM'd Tyler on Twitter, providing him with a name and address, basically telling him to go ahead and try it. Tyler didn't hesitate. Besides, this was his forte. He bragged many times on several Twitter accounts about previous swattings he'd done, even retweeting tweets about the events he swatted getting shut down, showing off to anyone who would give him even the slightest bit of attention, which incidentally was many people. Humans by nature love drama. We don't like when bad things happen to ourselves, but we enjoy reveling in the misery of others. So Tyler called the police, eager to have another laugh with his followers. He told them that he'd just shot his father and was currently holding his mother and siblings hostage at gunpoint. He then calmly stated that he'd poured gasoline inside the home and that, quote, I might just set it on fire, then promptly hung up. SWAT arrived shortly after and surrounded the address provided. They were prepared for a hostage situation. When Andrew Finch opened his door, he must have saw a shocking sight. Police ordered him to put his hands up and move slowly. However, Andrew made the mistake of moving his hand towards the waistband of his pants, I assumed to pull them up, a sort of unconscious movement. That was all it took. A single shot was fired at Andrew, and he died at the hospital only minutes later. The worst part of this, the man that provided the address to Tyler had provided the address of a home down the street. Andrew had nothing to do with any of this. In fact, his mother claims he didn't even play video games. When Tyler realized that his swatting had ended with a death, he immediately took to his Twitter. He attempted to convince anyone who was reading, and likely himself as well, that it was not truly his fault. He hadn't pulled the trigger. The cops had. He even went on the YouTube channel Drama Alert, where he sounded less than remorseful for his actions. Eventually, he was caught, but I suppose we will have to wait and see what the charges are. Let me know what you think the punishment should be down in the comments. And as always, be wary of the monsters out there.